Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, which is in the US, as I see somebody just came in from Berlin, which is amazing, and New Hampshire. We are talking today about the history of women's work, women working in by Janet Few, who is here with us from England to talk about her newest book. And I have to say, I'm super fascinated about this because I almost want to put women's work in quotes, but it's a different topic. So we'll get to that in a second. But I want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. We couldn't do it without them. I'd also like to thank Janet for letting us share this program with other libraries because, of course, when libraries work together, we make magic. If you have questions for Janet during her slides, put them in the Q&A, which is the button at the bottom of your screen. I will be turning the chat off during her slides, so we're not distracted and we can totally pay attention. You can buy books by Janet from any indie bookstore or online retailer, and certainly through her website. So I will be sending everybody a link to that in the recap email that I send out after the program. Janet is I loved chatting with her to get this program on up and going because she's just like this interesting history interpreter, writer, speaker, and researcher. And I was like, what is a history interpreter? That was my first question for you, Janet. And then how did you get to be a history interpreter? I just think that whole thing is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it brings history to life. It's experimental archaeology, really. It's trying to do things in the way that people would have done in the past. I spent quite a bit of my life living in the 17th century because why wouldn't you? And I almost got into it by accident, really. I wanted a speaker at a conference who ran a living history tourist attraction. And they said, oh, well, we haven't got enough staff at the moment. And I said, if I come and volunteer, will you come and talk to our conference? So I got into it by default, but it's not just about the dressing up. It's about trying to make history accessible to everybody and ordinary people's history rather than kings and queens and politics and wars and stuff. So that's what I'm about.
I love it. And like I said, this particular topic is about women working and the impact that they've had, which I think is again really interesting because my first thought was, is it women's work or what people identify as women's work? And maybe that's part of the conversation as well. But I really appreciate you being here, and I can't wait to hear everything you have to say.
Okay, I will share my screen again and hope it goes as smoothly as it did just now. Right, hopefully you can still hear me and you can see that, and off we go. And thank you very much for asking me. I am coming to you from the bottom left-hand corner of England. I'm in Devon. And so some of this talk will have a British focus, but some of it will be universal. And I hope it will be of interest wherever you happen to be in the world or wherever perhaps your female ancestors may have come from. And a lot of the things that I do focus on women's history because women often get squeezed out of the story. It's the men who are making the rules. It's the men who are creating the historic records by and large. It's the men who are in far greater numbers signing leases, writing wills, taking up civic office. So I think women need to squeeze their way into the narrative a little bit. And particularly today, we're going to look at women's work. Now, just to help you out, there is a bit of a handout or syllabus, as you might be calling it in America. That is on my website. I will put that web address up at the end, or maybe someone will pop it in the chat for the benefit of you. And if you go to the website, there's a tab that says talks and presentations. There's then a drop-down menu that says handouts, and you can click on the PDF for today. There isn't a lot of me recommending websites and resources in this particular talk, but that will give you other reading that you might want to do, for example. So we're concentrating on women then, and here you can see the pictures that I happen to have for my mother, my 2 grandmothers, 2 of my 4 great-grandmothers, and 5 of my 8 great-great-grandmothers. So as we go through this, I hope you will think of your own female family members and all the great aunts and the great-great aunts as well. And I think because it is so hard sometimes to find out about our female ancestors, we owe it to them to try and discover a little bit more about their lives. Now, women's work is divided into, well, I've divided it this way. Of course, there is housework, and a woman's place was seen to be in the home, and that was where she was expected to be, and her tasks were many and various, and we'll look at just one or two of them. And that, of course, is unpaid. We're also going to look at what I call home working. In other words, working for money, but working within the home. And then we're looking at work where you live in with your employer, and then outside work. So that's how we've divided it up. But let's start with some housework. And most women worked hardest at being housewives or perhaps unpaid assistants in their husband's work. So if their husband was a grocer, they might be helping in the shop, for example. If their husband was a smallholder, then undoubtedly the women would be doing things on the land. And of course, those women who did other work were still doing the housework because that was what was expected. Now, this is from a book that was written in 1615, and these are the expectations. Our English housewife must be of chaste thought, stout courage, patient, untired, watchful, diligent, witty, pleasant, constant in friendship, full of good neighbourhood, wise in discourse, but not frequent therein, sharp and quick of speech, but not bitter or talkative, secret in her affairs, comfortable in her counsel, and generally skilful in all the worthy knowledges which do belong to her vocation. Well, I think I'd given up after line 2, and needless to say, that was written by a man. And there are many roles for the housewife. She is going to be the cook. She's going to be the cleaner, the gardener, the nurse, the teacher, the dressmaker, the laundress. She's the farmhand, the dairymaid, the beekeeper, the brewer, the butcher, the baker, not the candlestick maker, if you know the nursery rhyme, but certainly the candle maker, and probably lots of other things as well. So I haven't got time to look at all those. We will be looking at one or two of them, but I'm particularly going to concentrate from a household point of view on just one of those tasks, which is going to be the dressmaker and the making of clothes for the family, which would have been expected unless you were particularly wealthy, when you got somebody else to go through this process for you. And it really does start with take your sheep. And normally that is the man's role, because we're talking of a time when gender stereotypes were very, very strong. So the man goes out and shears the family sheep. And certainly in a British context, people sometimes say to me, well, you know, my ancestors living in a town, there's no way they've got a sheep. And actually, that's possibly not true, because in villages and towns, there would be common land where people would be allowed to graze the odd sheep. They're not going to have a whole flock of sheep, but they might have one or two. So you start with your fleece. And first of all, you have to wash the fleece, and then it has to be laid out to dry. And a wet sheep's fleece is incredibly heavy. So a lot of the tasks that these women are doing is physically demanding. And then you pop it out in the sun for 3 or 4 days until it's thoroughly dry. Next, you have to card it, you have to comb it out, ready for spinning. And certainly in this country, we'd be using teasels, something like this. This is the common teasel. There's also something called a fuller's teasel, which actually is more suitable. It's harder and more cylindrical, but it's not so common. This is why this one is the common teasel. Or you'll be using carders, so bits of wood with nails punched through, basically, to card the wool. And then you can start to spin. Well, you might have the circular spinning wheel there, or if you aren't able to access one of those, you would have a drop spindle as shown in the centre. And these have been around for thousands of years. They're basically a weight on the end of a stick. The advantage of those, apart from the fact they were either easier to make or cheaper to acquire, is that you can spin on the move. So you can spin while you're keeping an eye on your children or keeping an eye on your cooking pot. And you spin and you spin and you spin and you spin. And basically, what have you got? Well, you've got a very large ball of wool, which you might choose to knit with to create your clothes. But if you want cloth, the next stage is weaving. And this is all things that historically would be done at home. As far as Britain is concerned, once we get the Industrial Revolution, so late 1700s and into the 1800s, these tasks are being taken out of the home to a large extent and put into mills and factories. And that creates all sorts of problems for women, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. And then you might be satisfied with clothing that's the same colour as a sheep, or you might want to dye that clothing, and that will be done normally using plant dyes of various kinds. And that's the point at which you get out your needle and thread and you start to make your clothing. There are other problems with clothing, of course. How are you going to launder it for a start? Historically, the answer is with woolen clothing, you're probably not. You're going to wash your undergarments, your linen or later cotton garments. But from the point of view of your woolen garments, why would you wash them? They will shrink. They will go hard. No, you don't do that. You just wash the undergarments. So that's just one of the many, many household tasks that women would have to do. But of course, the women's actual income in terms of bringing in money to the domestic economy was important for the survival of many, many households. And women had to find a way of doing that from home. So what they might do, for example, is take in lodgers or boarders, or they might take in laundry, or they might, and I don't know how common this would have been in America, but certainly it was very, very common in Britain, they might undertake home working. And certainly until very recently, society's acceptable pattern is that the man of the house is the breadwinner. But that often, as I say, wasn't sufficient. However, the responsibilities of running the household and childcare mean that it's quite difficult for women to make a financial contribution outside the home sometimes. And this is one of their possibilities. And this is undertaking what we call home working or piece working. It's sometimes called a cottage industry, which you can do at home. And the pay is directly related to output. So the more you produce, the more you get paid. And in order to maximize that income, you will be doing whatever you choose to do. And we'll look at some of those tasks in a minute. But you would be doing that for very long hours. And you would probably be roping in as many family members as you could, particularly children, including very young children, in order to add to the output and therefore add to the income. And actually, women who got particularly good at their tasks were often earning more than their labouring husbands. And many of the tasks also had a detrimental effect on the women's health, and we'll mention that as well. It also led to resentment. And I think it is because this gave women a measure of independence. And that wasn't always what fitted in with society's expectations. So as we'll see, a number of these women were accused of all sorts of things, probably completely unfounded. So we're going to look at a brief overview of homeworking and some of the tasks, particularly relating to the 18th and 19th centuries. And then we'll have a look at some in a little bit of more detail. So home workers then. In working married women were not a new phenomenon. Domestic responsibilities meant that women did favour working from home, but many went out to work as well. And certainly in our 1851 census, nearly 25% of married women were in some kind of paid work. That is almost certainly an underestimate. The 1851 census in Britain was taken in March. So all those women who had seasonal work on the land probably hadn't yet started it. And those who were assisting their husbands, that's often not recorded. And so it's notorious that women's work is underrepresented in the census. But what we find with homework is that it's more prevalent in some areas than in others. And it tends to occur in greater numbers where men's wages are traditionally lower, where many men were in either casual or seasonal work, or where there was a lack of other female employment available. So if there's a large mill nearby, for example, you're not going to get home workers because they've got another opportunity, or where there was a marked surplus of women. And the sorts of tasks that were commonly done as homework include making lace, making gloves, making buttons, plaiting straw, come back to that in a minute, making boxes, knitting stockings, carding wool, and there are lots of others. There are instances of women doing piecework that is more usually associated with men, things like making nails or making chains, and that would mostly occur in the Midlands. Let's have a little look at a map, and this just shows you where certain homeworking trades were particularly common. But there are also much more obscure types of homework, notably in London and the large cities. Things like making artificial flowers, covering tennis balls, making cigars, and so on. You don't find homeworking in such great numbers in mining areas or fishing areas, and that again is because the women had other roles. So piecework then, how does it work? Well, normally the raw materials are delivered. Sometimes you walked into a central point to collect them, but often they're delivered. And then the product of the previous week would be collected and you would be paid for what you had done. So let's have a look at how this impacted on lace making then. And there are two main lace making techniques. There's needle lace with a single thread and bobbin or pillow lace, which uses multiple threads. And the earliest lace was created just using a needle and thread, where a pattern was drawn onto a heavy backing cloth, which you then remove when the lace is finished, and that just leaves you with the delicate lace openwork. But needle lace was largely superseded by bobbin lace, as you can create a similar effect, and it's much quicker. And of course, if you're trying to produce as much as possible, you want to do it as quickly as possible, then you earn more money. And this requires several threads attached to small turned wooden sticks or bobbins. And different parts of Britain were associated with slightly different designs of lace. And as with most of these trades, a skilled worker might earn a reasonable sum, but may well be working 12 hours a day in order to do so. We find pillow lace workers predominantly in the home counties, so we're talking just north of London, for those of you not really familiar with British geography, Buckinghamshire, in the Midlands, and in Devon, where I am, particularly South Devon, that's bottom left-hand corner, the southwest. The towns of Nottingham, which is in the East Midlands, and Honiton, particularly highly regarded for lace, for example. And in a similar way to some other home industries, lace making was often taught in lace schools. Now, don't get any idea that this is any sort of educational establishment. There's no reading, writing, and arithmetic. This is women and young girls, and I do mean very young, 4 or 5-year-old, for example, and upwards, would gather together, probably in somebody's cottage, and older workers would teach the younger workers how to make lace and nothing else. There's no other education involved. And the intricate, close work often resulted in failing eyesight, or they needed to sit hunched over their pillows, so that led to problems with posture. There were a number of government reports into various industries in the 19th century, and they refer to the propensity to tuberculosis amongst young women in lace-making areas, partly because the humid atmosphere and lack of ventilation in which they were working. Most labourers' cottages had very small windows, for example, and they didn't want to use open fires because the smuts from the open fires would damage and make the lace dirty. So they used what were known as dicky pots, which are a kind of stove, I suppose, that is burning charcoal, but they also created unpleasant fumes. So that's a little bit, very briefly, about lace making. You could do a whole talk on any one of the things that I'm talking about today. So I'm going to go for lots of variety rather than a lot of depth. Another home industry is making gloves. And of course, there are all types of gloves. There are workman's gloves, there are leather gloves, there are silk gloves, there are lace gloves and velvet gloves, there are gloves with elaborate beading or elaborate embroidery. What would normally happen is that the patterns for the gloves, the cutting out, would be done in factories, often by men, and then it's the cut pieces that are delivered for sewing together. And the key here for the women was to keep your stitches very, very neat and very even. The types of gloves that were difficult to work with, so silk gloves, very difficult to work with silk. Those with elaborate beading, they were reserved for the most experienced workers. They were the ones, obviously, that you were paid more for. So gloving is a home industry of choice in several English counties, including Somerset, Worcestershire, Devon, particularly North Devon, Wiltshire, Hertfordshire, Herefordshire, Oxfordshire, Leicestershire. And certainly between 1790 and 1820, there was a thriving trade in Worcestershire, which is going to be one of the hearts of the Industrial Revolution. And about half of all English gloves were being made there at that time, employing 30,000 people, not exclusively women, but the majority would have been women. As fashions changed, the demands for gloves fell, and there are now so few glove makers, as in hand-sewn gloves, it's considered to be an endangered craft. So some regions are specialising in leather gloves and others in fabric. Oxfordshire had the contract for leather army gloves, for example. Leicestershire, particularly noted for its woolen gloves. By the time you get to the end of the 1800s, the introduction of the sewing machine completely changed the process. And we see many of these home industries dying out before the beginning of the 20th century because they have become mechanised processes, which is much more cost effective. What else might women do in the home? Well, they might make buttons. They were known as buttoners, and particularly two areas of Britain were common for this. Clearly, women had to have gloves and buttons wherever they were in the world. So I suspect, if you're somewhere else, some of these processes would be common. Dorset in the southwest was where they produced buttons that looked a little bit like this, wound thread buttons. And you would have a piece of wire which would be soldered into a ring, and then you would wind the threads across in various different patterns. Further north, places like Macclesfield in Cheshire, Leek in Staffordshire, it's silk button making. Workers were paid 3 shillings and sixpence a gross. A gross is 144. And in the 19th century, if you're good, you would get that per day. An expert could make a gross a day. Probably my favourite home industry, and this is partly because my great-great-grandmother did this, is the straw hat industry or straw plait industry. And what they're doing is plaiting straw to be wound into bonnets. And the straw hat trade in England centred on Luton in Bedfordshire. And part of the reason for that was that Bedfordshire and the surrounding counties, Cambridgeshire, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, were where suitable straw was grown. I actually tried this as part of an experimental archaeology course that I did. So this is a bit of the history interpreting. It's incredibly difficult, and you can't actually get suitable straw in England anymore because we now grow grain to have the strength in the ears, which is the bit we want, and it has much shorter stems than it used to do historically. The demand for plaiting within England boomed during the Napoleonic Wars at the turn of the 1800s because we had been importing plait from Italy. And we couldn't do that anymore. Napoleon stopped trade. And so the straw plait industry, which had been going on in this country before, really boomed. Now, when I say plait, I don't want you to think of 3 strands like you plait somebody's hair. This is quite complex plaiting, maybe 7, 9 strands in very intricate patterns for the more skilled plaiters. And like the lace makers, the young girls were taught in lace schools. This is a particularly idealized image of what a lace school or a straw plat school, sorry, would look like. You need those who are going to split the straw because it's done by splitting the straw vertically, and you need those who are going to plait. Now, when you're plaiting straw, it needs to be kept damp. So the platters would keep the straw in their mouths, which meant they had sores in the corners of their mouths. If they're dealing with dyed straw, then their mouths are turning blue, for example. Again, it involves a very strange sort of posture as you grip a bundle of straw under one arm and then you plait. This is another trade that started to decline by the 1870s, really, because it was replaced by imported plait. The straw plaiters were one of those groups of home workers whose reputation was tarnished. It was claimed that there were far higher rates of illegitimacy amongst the women who plaited straw, that they were their husbands became lazy, that they didn't know how to boil a potato, and all sorts of things. But actually, there has been research done into this, and they were no more likely to have an illegitimate child than anybody else. But that was the propaganda, I suppose. Right. Well, we've had a little look at working at home. What about living in and working in at somebody else's home? And of course, we're thinking predominantly here of domestic servants. And certainly in Britain, in the middle of the 19th century, 10% of the workforce were domestic servants, predominantly women, and 1 in 3 women aged between 15 and 24 was a domestic servant. It was seen as training for running your own household. By the labouring families, it was ideal because not only did you not have to feed or house or clothe your daughter, but she'd be earning some money as well. But not all domestic service is the same, and there's a huge difference between what the scullery maid would be doing and what the lady's maid would be doing. Mrs. Beeton's Household Manual, which was published in 1861, is available online in facsimile, in sort of download form, or you can buy it as a reprint. And it gives very detailed instructions about what the expectations were for different types of domestic servant. So my great-grandmother was a housemaid. There's 16 pages about what a housemaid was expected to do, for example. And of course, because these women were getting all their meals, they got their accommodation, they got their uniform, their pay wasn't particularly good. So a live-in cook in perhaps a middling sort of household might get £15 a year, a housemaid might get £11, that kind of thing. And you can find out about likely wages in the area you're in, perhaps by looking at old newspapers and looking for advertisements, for example. The other kind of living in, it relates to shop workers, but I'm going to talk about shop workers in a minute, so I'll mention that at that point. Now, there's a lady's maid for you. That's obviously, and she's got her beautiful pinny and her lovely cap there, and she's ironing lace. This is not the same, as I say, as the scullery maid who's scrubbing the dirty pots and pans. What about milkmaids then? And milkmaids and dairymaids are actually different. The milkmaids milk the cows and may well have sold the milk. The dairymaids use the milk to make butter and cheese. And ideally, you don't want the two being interchangeable, because if you're making butter and cheese, you need to be scrupulously clean. If you're hands-on with the cows, then probably you're not. Famously, the dairymaids and milkmaids, particularly the milkmaids, had clear complexions because they were not so subject to smallpox. What they got instead was cowpox, which is a similar illness, but much less severe and sufficient to make you immune to smallpox. And it's the cowpox that Edward Jenner and various others who were working on vaccinations took up and observed this and were able to use that. So, of course, A milkmaid or a dairymaid or some other kinds of farm workers may also live in. So although I'm moving now towards occupations where perhaps you would still be living at home, there are lots of farm roles where you might be living. You might be living on the farm. This is just a certificate. During the First World War, there were concerns, particularly about the loss of these schools. So these skills, these agricultural skills like poultry keeping and dairying and so on. And evening classes were set up. This is a certificate that was actually awarded in 1931 to try and encourage women to keep on with these skills, because by the 20th century, the job opportunities for women are opening up. And I think a lot of the old rural skills were being lost because women wanted to do rather different jobs. Now, I mentioned earlier on that fishing communities, you didn't see a great deal of home working. And that is because we're relying on the women in the fishing communities to mend the nets, to gut and clean the fish, to help haul in the boats, to take part in the pickling and the salting of fish. Notoriously in Britain are the herring girls. Now, the herring fleet, it's not quite the same now because where the herring shoals are has changed with the changing of the water temperature. But traditionally, the shoals of herring are found off the east coast of Britain. And they appear first in the north and work their way from Scotland down the coast of England. And they are followed by the herring girls. Now, these women were a rumbustious sort of group. They too had a reputation for being quite lively, should we say, because they're travelling, they're away from their home, they've got their independence. They were also quite famous for their elaborate knitting patterns. But they would follow the fleet from the north of Scotland down to the south of England on the east coast as the fish moved down. And they would be gutting fish at a tremendous rate. They could do roughly 60 a minute. Now, my partner is a part-time fisherman, and he reckons he can do about 11. So they're using sharp knives, so clearly that's dangerous. They've got their hands in salt because they're preserving the fish all the time. So really not terribly pleasant work. And it's seasonal work. So this is what they're doing from June until September. It's a chance, of course, to see the world. It's a chance to acquire a husband from elsewhere, perhaps. But certainly there they are with their barrels of fish that they are producing. A rather staged photograph, I think, there. And there's the more traditional uniform for the herring girls, these lovely striped aprons, what a lot of them would be wearing. The other area where I said there weren't so many working women working at home was in mining areas. Now, these are Cornish bowel maidens, or pit-brow lassies, they would be called further north. So in Cornwall, it's predominantly metal mining, so it would be tin or copper. In other areas, it would be coal mining. And this would be done by women throughout the country, whatever the type of mining. They would often start work very young, at the age of 10 or 11, and would carry on into old age, especially if they were unmarried women or if they were widowed. Now, they would work underground until 1842. Women were working underground, and then that was banned. And what wasn't banned was working at the surface. And this is really hard physical work. You're crushing ore, you're heaving carts full of coal, you're pushing wagons about. It is really very, very physically demanding. You're also exposed to dust, and that can be whether it's a metal mining or a coal mine, and that is going to have a really detrimental effect on your health, particularly giving you various kinds of lung complaints. This is a slightly different heavy industry. This is workers for the coal and iron company in Wigan, and they look quite a jolly lot, don't they? That's a little bit less staged. At least they haven't got pristine white aprons on, which you sometimes see in photographs. To me, that's a much more candid shot. I rather like that particular one. But what about the textile industry? Many, many women were working in the textile industry, and I've just taken you through very quickly the process of making clothes at home. And of course, the very word spinster is somebody who spins. And certainly the middle of the 19th century, you probably find half of all textile workers are female. And this is the time at which it's been taken out of the home and put into mills and factories. Factory work or mill work was notoriously hard. You've got the clatter of the machinery. You've got a lot of young children, male and female, but women were preferred because their fingers were more dexterous. And these youngsters would be expected to crawl under that machine while it was working in order to prevent clogging up or mend broken threads and so on. There's a slightly more modern photo of a textile mill by this sort of era. This, I think, is 1930s. You're starting to get at least some modicum of health and safety being introduced. Still on making of things to wear, let's look at the milliners, the hat makers or the haberdasherers. Now, millinery was to a large extent seen as a respectable trade, and they wouldn't just sell hats, they might sell ribbons, for example, that kind of thing. A magazine, a ladies' magazine of 1904 says this: "It costs far more to start a milliner's shop than a tea room. So the average lady milliner takes an upstairs floor, furnishes it artistically, interviews and buys from the travelling salesman, and waits with a certain degree of fear and trembling for the belated buyer." Now, although that sounds all terribly respectable, there was a suggestion that a milliner was a bit of a euphemism in some ways for being a prostitute. Now, clearly, nothing like everybody who claimed to be a milliner was a prostitute. But if you're filling in a census return or a record, you're extremely unlikely, when someone says, well, what do you do for a living, to say, well, actually, I'm a prostitute. So you're going to say, well, I'm a laundress, or I'm a milliner, or I'm a domestic servant. This is a different talk really, but where you do find references to prostitutes in the records, it's usually someone else who's identified them as a prostitute. So they'll be in an institution, for example, or it'll be a court record or something like that. Shop girls in general worked extremely long hours. And once the habit of shopping as we know it today, rather than marketing and going to market stalls, which were not permanent, developed, then the hours were extremely long. Shoppers expected to be able to shop for 13 hours a day, 6 days a week. And interestingly, although the 19th century, certainly in Britain, saw a lot of legislation which protected factory work, it tried to limit the number of hours they could work and improve conditions in various ways. None of those regulations applied to shops. And actually, the first British legislation that looked at shop work conditions was 1963, and then some health and safety legislation was extended. They had reduced the hours a bit in 1950 because all shops were forced to reduce their opening hours a little bit. The early 20th century is the era of the big department store, and traditionally women were normally found in certain areas of the department store. You're not going to get women in the hardware department. You're going to get women selling women's clothing, for example. And some of those workers in large shops did live in staff accommodation. So this can be, or could have been, live-in work. Notoriously, that accommodation was very substandard. and they would have very little freedom. Their lives would be very much controlled because they just went from the accommodation to the shop to the accommodation with very little freedom. There is a very big difference between someone who's working in a large department store or a town shop and someone who's managing the little village all-purpose store. And the latter, it may well be effectively working from home, because the front room could be the shop, and you might be able to combine that with things like childcare, for example. There was an interesting book published in 1864 called A Choice of Businesses for Girls. So this is basically a careers manual for girls. And Emily Faithfull, who's the author, writes about suitable careers, and she includes shop work. And this is what she says about shop work. This is good employment for a strong young person. A tall figure is considered an advantage, and the power of standing for many hours is requisite. A good deal of fatigue has to be undergone at first, but a shop girl told me that after a few weeks they got so used to standing it seems as natural as sitting. The life is far more healthy to most persons than that as a dressmaker. I don't quite see that, but that's what she says. The power of making out a bill with great rapidity and perfect accuracy is also necessary. And stereotypes rule here, because clearly the belief is no women can do mental mathematics. This is the point where women usually fail. A poor, half-educated girl keeps a customer waiting while she's trying to add up the bill, or perhaps does it wrong, and in either case excites reasonable displeasure. This displeasure is expressed to the master of the establishment, who dismisses the offender and engages a well-educated man in her place. He pays him double wages, but then feels sure that his assistant will not drive away customers by incapacity. Parents who intend their daughters to become saleswomen should take care that they're thoroughly proficient in arithmetic. Good manners are also requisite. The higher the class of shop, the more obliging and polishing the manners of the assistants are expected to be. The slightest want of politeness to customers, even if they are themselves unreasonable and rude, is a breach of honesty towards the owner of the establishment. For if customers are offended, they are likely to withdraw to some other shop. No one, therefore, ought to enter on this employment who does not possess entire self-command. Salaries range from £20 to £50 a year, often with board and lodging. Situations are usually obtained by private recommendation. So there we go. Some very different types of shop work for you there. And we know that until well within living memory, there are certain professions that were seen as women's work, seen as professions for women, and were often, certainly when I was at school in the 1970s, choices were a little bit limited, and certainly careers advice tended to, for those who felt capable of it, tended to be nursing or teaching. And so let's look at nursing first of all. Now, nursing wasn't really any kind of respectable occupation until the middle of the 19th century. A nurse wasn't really someone who was expected to try and make people better. They would just be attending on people who were sick. It was a fairly unpleasant sort of job because you're dealing, let's not put too fine a point on it, with bodily fluids and wounds and so on. And so often it was the drunken, the disreputable who were employed as nurses. And it wasn't until Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole, working in the Crimean War in the mid-19th century, started to bring nursing into some kind of respectability. And training schools began to be attached to hospitals, for example. But actually, until the 20th century, anyone could, in England, could kill themselves a nurse without any training whatsoever. And from then on, regulation began to be brought in. Conditions, salary, length of training was all very varied, or non-existent, of course, in the case of the training. If you're interested in nurses in Britain, or certainly in England and Wales, there are some records of the General Nursing Council at our national archives, but actually records of nurses are fairly few and far between. And then a specialist brand of nursing is seen as midwifery. And of course, this too was something that was often done by housewives for no pay. You went round and helped your neighbour when she was having a baby, and often there were 2 or 3 women in the village who were known to be skilled at this kind of thing, and that's who you called in when the time came. But those practicing as midwives in England and Wales, certainly from the 16th century, were supposed to be licensed. They were supposed to be licensed effectively by the ecclesiastical courts, so they were called bishops' licenses. And the reason that that was done was because those licensed midwives were then entitled to baptize babies who looked like they wouldn't survive long enough to be baptized in the local church. But many, many women acted as midwives without being licensed. Attempts to regulate and train midwives really didn't come in until the 1880s. And then increasing regulation and the insistence on some kind of licensing in the early 20th century. But this is a job for all women. It's very much a women's role, although there were man midwives, and now, of course, men work in obstetrics and so on. But this is very much a woman's domain, and a woman giving birth would have her gossips or her neighbours and friends surrounding her and supporting her. And this illustration, I think, is actually a 17th century depiction of a woman giving birth, and you'll notice she's sitting up. And that was pretty common until into the 19th century. So all those historical dramas that you see on television where they're all lying down and it's 1650 or something, probably wouldn't have actually happened. There's a very interesting guide to midwifery by a lady called Jane Sharp, which was written in the 17th century. And there are other later manuals and handbooks as well. And a lot of these are available online. There are also a number of historic guides for women, how to run your household. The earlier versions of Mrs. Beeton, they're available online as well. So if you're not going to be a nurse, then the expectation is you're probably going to be a teacher. And again, teachers or people who taught had varying degrees of qualification in order to do so. You have the women who ran what were known as dame schools in their cottages, and that's really just a form of baby minding. And often they didn't do a lot of actual teaching. Like nursing, teaching really starts to become a more regulated and a more professional occupation for women from about the middle of the 19th century. Some teachers learnt on the job. They learnt by having gone to school themselves, becoming what were known as pupil teachers, where they would help the younger students for part of the time and continue their own education for the rest of the time. And then by the second half of the 19th century, we see proper training colleges being much more common. This is Miss Beale and Miss Buss, who opened a prestigious school for girls in, I'm trying to think, 1870s. Something that perhaps, I will just show you this actually, because this is a record from the Teachers Registration Council, which for those teaching in England and Wales from 1870 to 1948, you might well find a little card for that. They're available online. You have the data providing website Find My Past. You can download those from there. So nursing, teaching, yes, we see those as traditionally female roles, and I need to qualify that with the teaching because it's the teaching of younger children that is the woman's role. Once you get older children, particularly older boys, then the expectation is that that will be done by men. And in fact, still today, there are far fewer men teaching young children than there are women. Less obvious, women preachers. Now, some evangelical groups, some denominations did make use of women preachers. And this was a bit of a novelty, and it was certainly gave women a freedom that they might not have had. These women might work as missionaries, they might travel to quite a great extent. But of course, they were also a novelty value. And so that might attract an audience if you're looking at open air preaching, for example. We all know there are various churches and denominations that still won't accept women preachers, but many did. And they were often better at it than the men, to be honest. But I think sometimes not only did it attract attention, it sometimes attracted the wrong sort of attention. Because if a woman's standing up in the village green preaching, then she's going to probably get heckled as well. I want to talk about the match girls. Now, the reason I want to talk about the match girls is because I think their story exemplifies a number of things about women's work. In the East End of London in the 1880s, the largest matchmaking firm were known as Bryant and May, and they still do make matches. And they employed at their height 3,000 people, almost all of whom were female. And by this time, we've got compulsory education, so the youngest were 13. But they would work a 12-hour day, paid anything between 4 shillings and 8 shillings a week, and they were paid on a piecework basis. Even though they were in a factory, they were paid by output, so they had to be quick, which meant they became careless. And what they're using to do this is phosphorus. And so that's poisonous. And they were also eating their midday meal on the same bench at which they were working. So they got what was known as phossy jaw or match girl's disease. So, oops, let's not go there yet. So you get toothache, swollen gums, your bones glow in the dark, and eventually you get brain damage and you die. And there was all sorts of protest about this. Cutting a long and very interesting story quite short here, but the entire factory stopped work in 1888. So this is the very early days of trade unions in general, and for a largely female and a largely young female workforce to go on strike was really quite significant. They did get some of their demands, but not all of them. Now, there's 2 types of phosphorus. One is more dangerous than the others. The Bryant and May used the more dangerous sort because it was significantly cheaper. And what they didn't get as a result of their strike was a change to safer phosphorus. So up came the Salvation Army, whose unique selling point was that they used safer phosphorus. Of course, this wasn't economic. And ironically, actually, the Salvation Army Match Company was taken over by Bryant and May. Just a couple more to come through, or one more really. We're going to look at women and war to a certain extent. We're going to look at munitionettes or munitions workers. Now, there were women working in munitions before the First World War, but it's normally associated with war work. And of course, the demand for ammunition meant that more workers were needed, coupled with the fact that many of the men, of course, were away fighting. And so these were going to be women. And certainly 1917, 80% of British munitions workers were female. They were paid half the men's rate. There was a regulation that said they had to be paid the same, but they had to be paid the same for the same job. So the loophole was that the men would be given one tiny, tiny little part of the process to do that the women weren't. And then they could claim that that was a different job. Quite apart from the dangers of the factories blowing up, and there were a lot of quite serious accidents, you're working with sulfur and it turns your skin yellow. They were sometimes known as the canaries, for example. They were provided with some kind of uniform, but it wasn't particularly all preventative from any kind of contamination. And so a number of women suffered from liver failure or anemia or infertility. But a lot of these conditions did not manifest themselves straight away. So although the estimate for Britain is that 400 women died from exposure to chemicals from working in munitions factories during the First World War, the important word in that sentence is during, because a lot of women suffered the after effects of having worked in a munitions factory after the war was over, and no one took account of that. Again, looking at war work, and just to finish off, women didn't just work in munitions factories, of course, they worked on the land. Here is just some women working on a farm, taking over men's jobs. They wouldn't normally be farm workers, and certainly women were in Britain were conscripted into the war work. You had to join one of the women's armed forces, or you had to go into a munitions factory, or you had to go and work on the land, or possibly as part of the timber corps, so working in forestry as well. So that's been, my time is almost up. That's been a real whiz through a whole number of occupations. I have been asked to talk about the book. They are, I think everything we've talked about today has a chapter in the book. There is also some case studies of some of the occupations, so you can read the story of a real woman who undertook that job. It's already available in hardback. It will be available, I've been told, as an ebook from the 31st of July. I'm pretty sure you can pre-order that now. Unfortunately, if you want a paperback, it's going to be another couple of years. But I suspect that won't be hugely cheaper than the hardback for you. And of course, there is postage to factor in. Now, if you want this particular book, you do have to go straight to the publisher. If you want one of the other ones that I've written, then try me. Although, again, if you're not in the UK, it's probably going to be cheaper for you to get those direct from another source as well, mainly because of the postage costs. But if you're desperate to buy one of my other books, get in touch. You can email me or contact me through my website, and I can tell you how to obtain one. So thank you very much. Thank you for asking me. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, even if your family are not from the UK. That is my website, and that's where you can get more information. So I will stop sharing and come back to you. There we go.
Wow, that was a lot of information in a short time. I mean, you basically talked about the entire history, like 400 years. Amazing. Janet has agreed to stay for a few extra minutes to make sure that we can get to some questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is at a button at the bottom of your screen. I have opened up the chat so you can chat with each other, but questions I'm looking for in the Q&A. So first of all, Janet, how much of this money that women were making throughout history were they allowed to keep? Because there weren't a lot of women's rights back in the day.
No, no. And I mean, technically, everything that a married woman owned, apart from the clothes she stood up in, and certainly in our country till 1882, was the property of her husband.
Mhm.
So I suspect not very much. There was a sort of tradition in farming communities that the women kept the egg money. And that seems to be pretty universal. If she sold her eggs, or maybe if she sold herbs or something like that she'd grown, she kept that. But of course, if the man said, well, you've just been to work in a textile mill, or the father or the husband, where's your money? You handed it over.
Mhm.
And you didn't have any rights to keep it. And even things like getting the job in the first place, maybe the woman would be expected to have her husband's or her father's permission, and often jobs were acquired through family recommendation, for example. And if you're one of the books I did was Women's Memories of 1946 to 1969, and the women who were contributing to that, it's not really my book, it's their collective memories, was saying, no, well, I wanted to be a nurse, but my father said, no, I couldn't do this, or I wanted to go to university, and no, that wasn't acceptable either. So this is very, very recent, I think, that women have had free choice in what they do. And in some communities, of course, they still don't. That's the way life still is.
Yeah, it seems like it would be hard to, I don't know, be independent if you can't keep any of your money.
Yeah, exactly. exactly.
Um,
But I think a lot of the women just accepted that that was the way things were.
right.
Mm.
Right. Okay, so April asks, what was the level of women's formal education during the 18th and 19th centuries?
Well, I can only talk from British perspective, and it was low. I mean, nobody had to go to school until 1870, and then from 1870 onwards, it was compulsory, but only up to the age gradually increased from 10 quite quickly to 12, 13, and then now it's 17. But certainly from the point of view of any kind of education post compulsory school leaving age, that was well, it was for men, because why would women need this extra education? Because goodness me, they're just going to get married and it will be such a waste. So that's the attitude into the 1970s,
Mm-hmm.
without a doubt. So from 1870, they would have had some education. And looking at things that were written in the 1870s, even by women who left school as soon as they could, I sometimes wonder if it wasn't a better education than some people are getting now. And actually, I mean, my father left school at 14 in the 1920s. I have letters that he has written, and they are far more grammatical and spelt correctly and so on, for example, than looking at school children's work of 16-year-olds today.
Mm-hmm.
Generalization, of course, but
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned that, or it spoke about the shop girls and the comment about not knowing math and
mm.
making people wait and making them upset. So was there like on the job training for the math so the shop girls weren't making people mad?
Well, I think they would probably be expected to have a certain level of competence before they would be taken on in the first place.
Mhm.
But yes, and certainly the big department stores, there was quite a lot of um, training and mentoring and that kind of thing. But not in a mentoring sounds all nice and gentle and fluffy and kind, doesn't it? I don't think it was necessary. There was a television series which you may be able to get in the States called Mr. Selfridge, which
Mhm.
was about Victorian shop work and how this all played out. And clearly it's a drama, so you take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. But it did seem to be reasonably well researched about what the girls went through.
Mhm. Lisa says it's on PBS, which
Oh, there you go.
there's like if you're a romance reader, you know that there's Selfridges and there's Harrods.
Harrods, yes, yes, yeah,
Oh, that, and I think it would be fascinating to read a history about that. Um, Ruth says, I have ancestors who were stonemasons and the family had a second income from a farm or inn. As the fathers in such a trade were away frequently, I believe the mothers were the primary worker in the secondary industry, in the second
yes.
industry. Would that be a good assumption?
I think it would. Yes, I definitely think it would. And often women, for example, if the husband was ill or away, or if he died, women would take over the husband's business in a way that a woman couldn't initiate that business.
Mhm.
So there's quite a lot of examples of women taking on as ship owners, for example. Now, the problem with doing that, of course, is that you're not respected in the way a man would be, and it's interacting with other ship owners where she would be expected to have a male spokesperson for her and all that kind of thing, because you don't have women in business. In fact, literally yesterday, I found a newspaper clipping about my great grandmother, who was poor and from a rural background. And the newspaper clipping said, this is 1894. She'd been proposed by somebody for the local parish council, so like the local government, I suppose, to stand as a voluntary role. And you can tell by the article that it is just treated as a preposterous idea because she was female.
Mm.
And Mrs. Braun may be a pillar of the Baptist community, but we've got two people far more suitable, and she wasn't proposed. She didn't give her permission to be proposed. Therefore, we're ignoring her and we're appointing to other men, of course, instead.
Mm.
So, this is the attitude to women across the board, sadly.
Mhm. I do want to point out one thing is I really appreciated that you wrote where you got your images from in all of your pictures. Somebody did ask about Wikimedia Commons,
Yeah,
where
yeah,
it's everything is available publicly, it's not under copyright, and it's
yeah.
free for us to use. And I use it all the time as a so as a librarian, I was like, thank you, Janet.
No, I'm very conscious of the fact that because I would have been fine if you weren't recording this, but I do all my talks on the assumption that someone might want to record them. And your American copyright law will be different, but our copyright law is if you record it, you are publishing it. And therefore, a whole new raft of regulations come in. And it's actually the person who presses the record button, not the person who's created the talk, that's committing the offence, as it were. So no, I try and be really, really careful about images that I use, which is a bit restrictive sometimes. And sometimes you see something, it's, oh, I wish I could use that. It's lovely. But I don't, as a policy.
Well, I appreciate it so that I won't get into trouble for this one.
And I should say that there are illustrations in the book as well.
Okay, cool. I believe we have the book in the library, but so if people are local, they can certainly check it out from us, or any of our local libraries that have it. So Nikki says, so these women worked all day and then did the chores at home when too. What are the men doing that so much work was required by these poor women?
Well, I mean, I'm trying not to be sort of reverse sexist here, but the men worked incredibly hard as well, particularly you think of men working on the land and so on and things like that. But they tended to do one thing. So you were a carpenter, you were a blacksmith. They didn't do this whole multifaceted range of tasks that the women had to be good at brewing, they had to be good at nursing, she had to be good at tending to the herb garden and so on. I mean, agricultural work, sometimes that could be very varied as well. But it's a whole range of different skills that she's got to be good at. And she's not paid, for all that house, she's not paid. So there we
Lisa
go.
says, and I agree, like it's still that way where we're like, the chauffeur and the cook and the, blah, 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 it goes on and on. So change that dramatically, except that we are allowed to keep our money. Um,
Yes.
Violet comments, my mom was forced to quit school after her second year of high school in the late 20s and work in a home. Her father was there every Friday for her paycheck.
Yeah.
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 So it's, that's not that long ago. It's like 100 years.
No, no. Although conversely, in some cultures, and this certainly happened in working class culture in Britain, it was almost traditional for the man to hand his pay packet to the woman who was going to manage the household finances, and she would give him back his cigarette money or whatever.
Mhm.
So it did work both ways in that sense. I think that's more of my impression, and of course evidence is so sketchy for what actually went on. It is that this is more of a mid-19th century onwards kind of idea until maybe the 1950s or the 1960s. And of course, if you go back much further, there's a lot more about barter and exchanging of skills rather than actually money changing hands. So I'll help deliver your baby if make my new outfit or that kind of thing.
Mhm. Well, I think, and you probably, because you're a historian, probably know that human nature is human nature. So there'll always be some families that do it what we
Yeah.
think is the right way, and some people that don't.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. And it is a cultural thing as well. It does vary with different cultures, but and of course varies over time, which is why I'm fascinated by it. But I do like to try and bring the women out of the shadows a little bit in the things that I do, because I do think they get a little bit of a raw deal.
It is a raw deal. Margot asked a question. I'm not, maybe I missed something, but she asked, how about Mrs. Warren's profession?
Not familiar with that. Is
Okay.
that I suspect that might be another television program that's passed me by,
Okay. All right.
possibly.
Oh, maybe. Yes. All right. I don't know. But that is all we have for questions. Janet, this has been fascinating, just as I expected it would be. And I do appreciate you shining a light on something that people don't understand and don't know enough about.
Oh, I hope people have found it interesting, even if they don't necessarily feel it's so relevant to their own personal story. I think it's still interesting on a broader level, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, as a librarian, I think it's important for me to know like the full story, not just the one that is told to us by certain people.
Yes.
So I really, oh, she's alluding to a George Bernard
Ah,
Shaw play and
yes.
what it addressed. Okay. Thank you, Margot.
Mm,
I love it. People have such differing experiences in life. Janet, thank you so much. Thank you all for
right.
being here with us, and I hope you have a wonderful day and look up Janet's books. They're so interesting and cover so many different areas that we should all know about.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day, everyone.